Thank you for joining this webinar with RudderStack and Loveholidays. So here's a quick overview of what we are going to cover today. So the topic is real-time e-commerce analytics with BigQuery and RudderStack. We'll actually talk about sort of more complex parts of the stack as well. But we'll get into that in a bit. So we'll do introductions. You'll get to meet David from Loveholidays. We'll talk about the evolution of the e-commerce stack. So how are things done previously? And then how are they done today, sort of by forward-thinking companies like Loveholidays. David will talk us through what warehouse-first analytics is and how that compares to SaaS analytics solutions for e-commerce. We'll talk about site speed, which is a big deal. It's been a big deal in e-commerce for a while. It's becoming critical for e-commerce, and then also really sort of any consumer-facing experience. And then David's going to walk us through how he feeds both marketing and data science from the warehouse, model that we're seeing more and more in modern companies. And then we'll talk through some of their plans around doing some real-time recommendations. So let's dive in. David, welcome. Thank you for joining the webinar. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Eric. And yeah, good to be here. I guess just an intro for me. I'm currently head of engineering at Loveholidays, or in the US, you'd say Love Vacations. We currently sell holidays and hotels in the UK and in Ireland. We generally have around 20 million unique users a month. So pretty big scale, and data is a key part of basically everything that we do, and especially when we're trying to kind of monitor customers. And I'm responsible for how we apply it, and not how we analyze it. Luckily, that's our data science team. And then also, you know, how we feed that in from the website, and how we filter all of those events into some good views for the business.
Very cool. And just a quick question: what were you doing before you joined Loveholidays to lead engineering?
Yeah, so I was head of engineering for Uswitch, which is a price comparison website, and I actually did like a lot of the same there. In fact, integrated in similar approaches at Uswitch, and I spent 7 years there, putting all of the kind of core infrastructure and the website together with about 8 engineering teams.
Wow, tons of experience. Can't wait to learn more. Quick introduction from me. I'm Eric Dodds, and I lead customer success here at RudderStack. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the evolution of the e-commerce stack. And this is a subject that David and I chatted about before the webinar as we were preparing, and I think it's really interesting. So, David, let's just talk through some shifts that we see. And just to set the context here, we're talking about really modern companies, right? And pretty large scale companies, right? So this doesn't necessarily apply to, you know, maybe a smaller e-commerce business running on a platform. But before, a lot of companies, even really large scale, and you still see today a lot of companies running platforms, but we see a larger move to owned infrastructure. So that's sort of the migration from Shopify to modern JavaScript frameworks. You want to talk a little bit about that, David, and why we see that happening?
Yeah, so I guess this is, you know, it depends on where you're at in the business, at the kind of business level, right? You start up, scale up, and scale out. But I think a lot of the time you end up building some basic systems. They do what you need them to do, and once you start growing, you want to differentiate yourself, and you want to start building out something that is potentially more custom and dealing with your demographics in a better way. And additionally, want to move quicker, right? Maybe you have your own engineering team at that point, and you're building several other engineering teams. Once you have that, there's probably a desire to start building out your own platform, and very much kind of catering on the e-commerce side. You're building out, that's your differentiator, right? I think especially in the Loveholidays world, we've decided to build our own e-commerce platform because that's how we become the best holiday finder for customers. And I think that's the same can be applied for most e-commerce sites as you start scaling up and then scaling out.
Sure. Yeah, I think a interesting way to summarize that would be platforms are great. I mean, Shopify is really an incredible tool in many ways, but by nature, it has to do many things for many types of users. And as you grow and focus, you reach the limitations of that.
Exactly, and I think it's the classic build versus buy, and figuring out at what point in your time, like I guess in the growth of your business, that you decide to do that. But
Sure.
because accessibility of building your own platform and owning that, I think it means that a lot more people are building versus buying because of the versatility of what they can do with it.
Sure. All right, so third-party vendors and black box, machine learning and AI, I put that in quotes because that's a subject unto itself. But I think we're seeing a shift towards, from some of those tools, again, as we think about companies that are scaling to massive volumes with more focus, more to an own data science function. And one example I'll give here is recommendations. So you see, I mean, there are tons and tons of third-party SaaS tools and plugins and everything for e-commerce. And a common one you see is recommendations, right? Like make the best recommendations, and it's sort of an outsourced algorithm of sorts. But more and more we're seeing people move towards own data science, and I think that's something that's happening inside of Loveholidays. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, right? I think that like preset machine learning models and black box AI vendors, etc., they can only get you so far. And I think that once you start understanding the domain and the needs of your customer and the data that you have, it starts becoming quite apparent that having an in-house data science team to build out those models is going to get you there a lot faster over time. I think like you and that's where Loveholidays is at now, right? It takes a lot of time initially to kind of gear up and get that all set up and make sure that you have the right people to build out those models, but also to kind of think about what we should be looking at in the future. But once you have that, you can move a lot more quickly because of everything's in-house, the models and the underlying technology is understood, and we can make tweaks and we can continuously improve it to actually cater much better for our customers. I think there are the kind of black box recommendation engines that you just feed it data, but in fact, if you think about a holiday and all of the different combinations, and actually we know that for example, people that are in the south of England have a larger propensity to book Greek islands versus in the north of England. And once you start thinking about the complexities of demographics and holidays, it made a lot more sense for us not to potentially buy that system, but actually build it in-house so that we can own it and evolve it over time.
Sure. Very cool. We'll just, I'll quickly go through number 3, siloed data before to unified data in the warehouse. This is pretty common. I mean, there are still a huge number of companies who are in the process of making this shift or haven't made it yet, but I think most of our audience will really have a good handle on why that's important. The example here is many times, especially in an e-commerce context, you're using Google Analytics very heavily. I mean, it was sort of the standard tool for optimization in e-commerce, and then some sort of combination of internal platforms pulling data from the database and somehow combining all of that information to produce some sort of business intelligence, which is sort of a technical mess, versus leveraging a modern data warehouse like BigQuery and just dumping all of your data in there, which works way better. So let's skip to the last one because I want to be conscious of time. It's sort of common knowledge in e-commerce, speed equals better performance, better conversion rates, etc. And it's been that way for a while, but speed is really becoming mandatory. Recently, Google released news that they're going to have even more strict requirements around site speed. So David, talk to us about your experience dealing with that. It sounds like you've had a decade of dealing with sort of the front end user experience in an e-commerce context. So tell us about site speed and how things have changed.
Yeah, so I think like it's quite funny. I think we've put ourselves into this position by building complex applications driven by JavaScript, but that's a
we
topic
we
for
blame
another.
ourselves.
Yeah, that's a whole other webinar. I think that in performance is something that at Loveholidays and at USwitch we proved that it had a significant impact on conversion. And but it's not just about the conversion side of things now. It's actually about SEO visibility. And over my kind of 10 years working in front end, I've focused drastically on performance, not just because it gives you a better experience, but you tend to build better systems if you focus on performance systems. And nowadays, everyone is trying to kind of chase this performance goal. And now that Google has said it, it's obvious that we need to kind of ensure that we are at least adhering to some sort of principles around it. Driving better experience is one thing, but also ensuring that you're building something that is maintainable for the future. And the Google requirements is just that kind of last key point where I think a lot of companies that have probably been doing it maybe ad hoc have now sort of said, well, actually, we now need to do some serious work on this because
Sure.
in fact, it's going to affect our SEO, which then, of course, in turn affects your overall revenues if you're
Sure.
relying on that traffic source.
Yep. Kind of making performance a first principle as opposed to a project.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about warehouse first analytics versus SaaS analytics. So going back to the point earlier around, heavily using Google Analytics and, all the other sort of e-commerce SaaS analytics tools versus the warehouse. So David, I don't want to go through bullet by bullet. I'd just love to hear you talk to these points around what are the challenges and even benefits around SaaS analytics. And then why did you make the strategic decision to move to warehouse first analytics, where you're sort of streaming events into the warehouse and then doing what you need to do there in a variety of contexts, but a primary one being the analytics use case?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think just to kind of quickly talk about the benefits, right? With when you've got SaaS analytics, you drop in a script and hey presto, you've probably got some sort of view on your customers and maybe conversion and even performance metrics through some dashboard that Google Analytics or some other provider has given you, which is great, right? I think it's like that's a really great start to understand the data that you have and the website
Sure.
usage. But the problem becomes that once you start wanting to do more with that data, once you start wanting to like use that data with other parts of data and actually build out potentially more complex dashboards, or in fact enhance the data that you have on the site, things become a bit more brittle. And because SaaS analytics tries to generalize for all, you end up with a mishmash of data sets. You probably end up with some of your custom queries, and you probably end up with trying to build views on top of things that were never meant to be built upon. And I think that gets quite hard over time, because as you want to absorb more data and as you become maybe more data assisted in your day-to-day, you probably want to have that unified view of everything, and you want to have that deeper dive into that data. So that's kind of like where the limitations lie. And I think the other part, right, is because when you with SaaS analytics, it's like it's trying to do everything, and when it's trying to do everything, they focus more on features versus performance, which means that actually you're probably loading in loads and loads of JavaScript to potentially just track some page views, and you don't need it, but because that's been built up over time, that
Sure.
all of those additional features are just there, and you can't really do much about it. And naturally, you can't really contact Google Analytics and tell them, hey, can you give me something different, please? So that's I think where it gets quite hard. And then you start thinking, well, do I build my own or do I do something different? And I think that's where warehouse first analytics really come into play, and where we've seen the big benefits from it.
Sure. Yeah, it is interesting going back to just thinking about our conversation around the platform versus, sort of modern JavaScript infrastructure for e-commerce. It seems like SaaS analytics is similar, where there's a great place for it, very useful. But as you get into scale and specificity, the tools that are sort of all things to all e-commerce users don't really make sense, or they make more complex optimizations untenable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's like one of the things that you end up trying to do at larger scale, and when you're a bigger company and when you want to have that visibility, is unify your data and unify and visualize it in the same way so that you communicate in the same way to all of, everybody in the business. And unfortunately, if you have 25 dashboards trying to tell you one individual thing, maybe one's for performance and one's for, web analytics and the other one's for conversions, you end up not being able to create that cohesive view for the business and for yourself.
Sure. Very interesting. And then let's talk quickly about cost. So one thing that is really common is you start out using a SaaS provider, and it is very cost effective initially, but the unit economics, especially in e-commerce, can be or can have a very, very low tolerance for cost at scale, right? Where, sort of at a lower scale, the pricing models make sense, but then as you scale up, you're looking at, basically what are the unit economics around each transaction. So is that something you've experienced with SaaS tools that you've used in any of your previous roles or Loveholidays?
Yeah, so I think that when we start talking, I think like specifically, there's some products out there that are great, but unfortunately charge you for that kind of what they call an active user, or a user ID. And when you start growing and when you start adding customers to your data, to I guess your visits, then it becomes pretty hard to afford that sort of cost. And I think some systems go to some ridiculous numbers, which makes it really, really tough to justify. I think that the flip of that as well is that the SaaS analytics, where maybe it's free for a good period of time, or it's free for forever for all numbers, then actually don't give you any sort of features that you can use to then analyze it, right? So it's like you have those two models, where one of them is that if you're at scale, you pay hundreds of thousands, or you pick a free system that then actually to do anything with, you probably need to pay hundreds of thousands to get the data out of it. I think Google Analytics is a good example of that.
Sure. Yeah, with 360.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, speaking of 360, so this was the stack that you had before. So do you just want to give us a quick run through, and then we can look at the stack that you're running today?
Yeah, sure. So when I joined Loveholidays, we have a very complex conversion rate model and attribution model, which I'll talk about in a second. But all of the data and all of the sort of analysis was based on analytics, and we paid for Analytics 360, which if you don't know, Analytics 360 lets you export data into BigQuery. Now, you have no control over said export, and actually that export, it happens every day, but you don't know if it's going to break or not, because in fact you have no visibility into what Google is doing. And I think on average, out of 7 days a week, we would end up with at least 4 days a week with delays in reporting. You can imagine the cost of that to the business, because in fact, this was our way of reporting on attribution and conversion. And sometimes we weren't even getting our conversion reports the next day. So, the CEO was waking up in the morning, looking at the dashboards, and the dashboards hadn't updated. So we had no idea about our performance. And then to top that all off, we were using, like, Tableau was feeding into that. And Tableau is fine, but unfortunately, we couldn't scale that out to the entire business. So there was limited company visibility into some of the deep analysis or the deep attribution kind of conversion rate models that we built. So it was very hard to kind of, and this just kept becoming an issue over time. So it was clear that we needed to move away from this.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine, days of delay in conversion reporting during a peak season for travel e-commerce is very damaging.
Yeah.
From a business standpoint.
And I think just to add to that, right, we were running like loads of A/B tests. So it's important to be able to see that performance. Sure. and that we had a different service looking at that information. But if we moved to, like, we also moved to our own system, and we didn't have the same visibility as quickly as possible, because we were still using Google Analytics to report on conversion.
Right, which becomes a significant efficiency problem, right? Because you're running an A/B test, and if you don't have the results, even 1 or 2 days of something not working, you want to turn it off, once you see the statistically
Exactly.
significant results. Okay, the warehouse first stack. So talk us through what you run today.
Yeah, so we've kind of like, when I joined, we didn't even have a mobile app. Now we do, and we currently feed all of our data through RudderStack, all of our web events and all of our app events, and even some of our server side events from some of our applications. And that just we have a destination that's set up to BigQuery. That destination gets updated every 15 minutes. And then we have multiple different kind of use cases for that. And we chose BigQuery as our store primarily because that's where we can do a lot of different things off the top of BigQuery. The plan of that, which I'll talk about in a bit, is to move to PubSub. But currently, we then feed all of our BigQuery into Data Studio, and every team has different views on top of all of these events, and they can kind of create their own visualizations depending on what they want to see from the web events that we send. And then we have Looker, which is kind of, we're not thinking of moving everything potentially to Looker, but Looker is way more powerful for when you want to slice and dice the data and potentially add different data sets that may not be in BigQuery at that given point. So we have that for some deeper dive views, especially when we talk about conversion rate. And actually, the big thing that we do off the back of all of this data is we have financial data, et cetera, that we need to process to add to our attribution report to understand how much money we've made, et cetera. So we run a job off BigQuery, we export to Avro, we put it into cloud storage, and then we run through Apache Spark, where Apache Spark connects to a load of different databases and a load of different endpoints where we gather data from different parts of the company, but also external. And then that actually processes what we would call user sessions in our attribution report, and then filters it back into BigQuery. So we have this like great view of our conversion and attribution, but it's also always readily available, right? Most people now have the ability to kind of see data within several hours versus, I think, it's sometimes several days.
Sure. Yeah. And we called this real-time e-commerce analytics, and, real-time is an interesting term for sure, but you went from, so you're doing event stream via RudderStack into BigQuery, and you went from every 24 hours via Google Analytics 360 to 15-minute syncs to all your downstream tools.
Yeah. And I think
That's incredible.
it's pretty crazy, right? Like, I think it's something that we celebrate regularly, because what we actually did for a long time with the data engineering team was, if the reports didn't come in by 9 a.m., it would be an incident. So you can imagine that most of the time the data engineering team was responding to an incident because the reports weren't coming in, and it wasn't under their control. But I think it's a big win to go from, like, I guess 60% a week incidents to no incidents, because now we have that kind of clear and very quick way of reporting.
Very cool. That's incredible. And really cool that you're using, BigQuery is a really cool tool. That's probably another webinar because I'd love to nerd out on that. But Data Studio is a great tool for many things. And then the combination of Data Studio and Looker for different purposes, I think, is really smart in many ways, because Data Studio can be really good for self-serve type things, but it has its limits. So it's kind of cool to see that analytics stack there.
Yeah. I think Data Studio definitely has its limits. I think it's getting better by the day, and they're constantly adding to it. But I do see that as kind of like the smaller child of Looker, where it's great for that immediate, like, quick visualization. And then if you want to go and do some bigger visualizations and connect to other things, then Looker is your choice.
Sure. Very cool. All right, let's talk about site speed, because we mentioned this before, but we actually had the chance to work with you to do some pretty cool things with the SDK. So initially, when we started talking, you had some pretty significant requirements around speed. So I'd love to just talk about the limitations of the SDKs you were using before, and then just talk us through the two methodologies that we work together to sort of have a significant stepwise decrease in load times.
Yeah, so I guess prior to RudderStack, we'd actually started migrating to that warehouse first analytics with Segment, and I think Segment does some things really well, but unfortunately, with our kind of clear focus on performance, we'd noticed that the Segment JavaScript snippet wasn't exactly particularly performant, and was also doing a lot of things that we didn't need it to do. We have, I think, quite a straightforward warehouse first integration. I think others don't, but at the same time, we wanted to be able to change it, improve it, make it better. And it didn't seem that we could. And unfortunately, we were seeing that generally in Lighthouse and performance scores, Segment was one of the kind of key outliers, along with Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. But in fact, we felt that for what we were doing with Segment, it was causing us problems, and we didn't really see a way out of that. And Segment has gone for that jack of all trades, trying to do everything, and trying to do and with all of the destination integrations it has. But we felt like it wasn't configurable enough to give us that performance, and so that's why we started looking for an alternative where RudderStack came in. And I think that to talk about like where we came from, so we worked really closely with RudderStack, which was awesome at the start, to kind of define what we thought was a good JavaScript SDK, and give some context around the performance and what was needed, and why we thought that this was kind of the key part for us going forward. And I think there were kind of two key areas, right? One of them was generally like the size of the bundle. So like download as little as possible depending on what you're using it for, which was which I was really well understood, because I think what had happened is RudderStack had built out the destination support for all of the key destinations, but was still loading that all for everybody. And now and with that kind of context of, well, actually, you can load, we could just choose to what we load in, and most. Now, I'd argue that most companies, right, have some control over their code. So you want an engineer to potentially connect a destination up, which means that we can then just say, well, we'll require that destination explicitly. It meant that RudderStack moved towards this model of it'll only load in the libraries needed for the destinations that you're defining, which reduced the bundle size drastically. I can't even remember the numbers. It was something like 200 kilobytes to 60 kilobytes or something like that, which was a huge win, and also reduce the kind of the parsing time and the execution time of the script. There was another piece actually that isn't necessarily called out here, but I think it's super cool, because it's something that we do with all of our JavaScript. Is the RudderStack SDK only sends modern JavaScript to modern browsers and legacy JavaScript to older browsers, which means that your users that are using a more modern browser, which is always going to be over 90%, are actually getting a much smaller bundle than the users that are because it's heavily optimized for that modern browser, which I think is awesome. I think more companies should be doing stuff like that, because it starts you can start focusing on building something that's performant for the 90% versus for the 10%. And then I think the second one was then starting to think about well, we send a lot of events when you land on a page, and those events can be synchronous, because the default XHR request is always synchronous. How do we ensure that we don't block the main thread, and how do we ensure that the rest of our experience continues to happen, and we can still get all of those events from RudderStack? And that's where we started trialing out this the beacon, which is a widely supported API, but actually, in fact, a lot of SDKs still don't use it because of legacy browsers potentially, but also because there are some quirks with it. But we wanted to start using Beacon, one, because it's asynchronous, especially when you're offloading events after you move from one page to the other, and two, because it improves the performance from kind of the sending of those events. And we actually ran an A/B test of this, and we were trying to measure the impact was on loading time, was on total blocking time, and on first input delay. And if you don't know, first input delay is one of the key core Chrome Web Vitals that Google will start reporting on as a key one for SEO scores as of May. And you can see the graph that actually shows that the first input delay of the Beacon, so the using the Send Beacon API, was just dramatically lower, right? So like, I think it was like 200 and something, nearly 300 milliseconds actually, to under 20 milliseconds first input delay, by moving off the synchronous XHR request to the Beacon. And naturally, we can just turn this on, right? So people that still want to use the XHR, because there are some reliability pieces then that you can choose to, but the performance impact was huge. And now we are confident that this isn't going to affect our first input delay for the future.
Incredible. Well, I can say from experience, it was really fun to work with you on building those out. And we still talk internally about the performance improvements because it's pretty incredible. Okay, let's talk quickly. So one of the interesting things about a warehouse first approach is that instead of leveraging multiple SaaS tools, you can actually feed marketing with the analytics use cases we talked about, but you can also feed data science. So can you just quickly talk us through, what types of data products are you delivering to marketing and product teams, and then also the data science team?
Yeah, so I think like the product is his BigQuery data really, but we then have managed to kind of overlay that with some really great reports for marketing and product around intraday conversion rate reporting, which they've never had before. So being able to kind of see that hourly view has been really great. And then I think the other one that I've already mentioned is that attribution reporting, which is always available on time, and actually then will alert to any kind of anomalies that we've seen. But speaking of anomalies, I think the more interesting one is really where data science is starting to feed into this, and data science is now using this data that's practically, 15 minutes to us is real time, and is using the data and consuming it for multiple different uses. One of them is we are consuming that kind of that data for anomaly detection. We have our own anomaly detection system called Helios, and we actually feed it all of the BigQuery data in different kind of cuts, so that it starts learning and it actually alerts us on Slack if there's anything that's off. And that's been really awesome because prior to that, we could only really use the anomaly detection for anything that was somewhat fresh data, and it wasn't really to do with the users on the site. It may have been site errors and things like that, because we use different services for that, but not actually conversion rate, which I think is it's our bread and butter. That's what we use to measure. And then I think the two other points for data science that have been really awesome was now we have our A/B testing platform is fully in-house now, and because we have this regular fresh data, we can actually refresh that data hourly, and we have some very complex models behind how we figure out if an A/B test is winning or not, and because we run lots of different ones. But now we can actually understand them way faster than we could before. And we have that visibility for the entire company of all of the tests that we're running across the entire business and seeing that update on a regular interval. I think the last one that I didn't put down there is the kind of, we're building now a smart sort order, and that smart sort order is all based off the RudderStack data that happens on a 15-minute interval. So like we're now building out a model that is going to try and beat the current sort order that we have, by taking in all the impression data, the product click data, the product detail data that we feed RudderStack, and then start actually applying a different sort on an hourly basis to try and understand what's the most optimal sort order for finding a holiday.
Very cool. That's so cool. I love nerding out on stuff like that. A quick question for you on the A/B testing infrastructure. What were the main drivers of bringing that inside of the company and sort of owning it as opposed to using a third party. Because that's I mean, bringing a lot of things in-house are non-trivial, but that's you start to get into some pretty gutsy, statistical significance modeling, et cetera, all that with A/B testing infrastructure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think that there were multiple different reasons. One of them, I think, going back to that SaaS model, was cost. We, with the sheer size that we're at, we were talking in the $500,000 cost a year for some of the A/B testing services out there that were quoting us for our use. But that wasn't just one of them. I think in addition to that, what we wanted to control, one, the way that we were doing our A/B test, but we also wanted it to feed it with our own data. And you can't really do that with external A/B testing systems. And I think one of my pet peeves is I don't really trust external A/B testing systems most of the time. So I'd rather have myself and a data scientist spend some time looking at the numbers and having the control of that. But when you start thinking about the next steps of A/B testing, you start talking about what you call multi-arm bandit testing, which is smart smart multivariate testing that will change the traffic allocation depending on how well the test is performing. Wow. But you can only really do that if you own the A/B testing framework, because you want to use your own models to understand how tests are doing better. And that's when it starts getting very interesting. And that was, one of our core parts of the business is running A/B tests, because that's how we test and learn when we're not user researching. And that was just one of the key things where we felt we can build this in-house, we can probably build it better, and we can always upgrade it with our own pieces, much like, the warehouse first model. And we felt like it was a clear one that we would do in-house.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting example, and we'll move on to the next slide in just a second. But I think it's a really interesting example of how complexity of sort of both the process and requirements, but also the technology change when you get to scale, right? SaaS tools are great up until a certain point. But when the requirements reach a certain scale and level of complexity, having ownership is a big deal. That's something we actually talk about a lot, where when companies aren't at that scale yet, it actually is still helpful to make the investment of unifying your data in the warehouse now, so that you have that data to build models in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about a project you have coming up. And I know this is still early, but it's pretty cool. So real-time recommendations with RudderStack and Redis. And I can just talk through, this is just a basic, this isn't necessarily reflective of your exact stack, but this is just sort of a basic view for the audience. So there's sort of two components that we usually see. One we call the behavior-based or page-to-page personalization, which you're running an SDK, in your website or app that's coming through the RudderStack event stream. That can feed Redis, and then you're running a model that makes recommendations, and Redis uses that information that's coming in real time to sort of modify the user experience. And a classic example we give there is, someone makes a purchase and you want to recommend additional products that they might want to purchase. And that's this sort of page to page, right? When the confirmation page loads and they see, other products that they want to purchase, you can drive that using the event stream in Redis, which is really cool. The other thing we see that's interesting is using warehouse actions for more demographic focused or sort of user profile focused personalization. So for example, a lot of companies and, maybe when you're thinking about enriching a user profile with some sort of maybe third-party data source or some computed trait in the warehouse, you can actually push that back from the warehouse using RudderStack warehouse actions into Redis. So there's a profile store. And the example we give here is, let's say you have a computed trait that says someone's more likely to respond to a particular offer in a particular season. And so you want to serve that to them the next time they open the app. Well, if you push that from the warehouse into Redis, and Redis is driving the model that opens that up, or we even see companies using downstream SaaS tools like Braze, that sort of manage mobile experiences, or a lot of internal builds as well. you can drive that with computed traits on a profile level as well, which is really interesting. But I want to hear about what you're thinking around personalization at Loveholidays.
Yeah. I mean, it's super interesting stuff, really, with what you can do with it. And I think the initial one of the things actually that we've recently we tested and figured out is we have this concept of what we call recently viewed hotels. And this is, a lot of customers that come to us use us to browse a lot of hotels and to get an understanding of what options they can go on and what hotel they want to potentially take a look at. And interestingly enough, what we found out was we have a kind of very dumb feature on the homepage that stores all of those recently viewed hotels on your browser, and then you can see them again on the homepage. And in fact, it has a pretty significant conversion rate if we remove that. So what the hypothesis behind that is, actually people like to kind of go back to the things that they've seen, but actually now we want to think about, well, what about if we suggest to them the next hotels that they should be looking at based on their viewing behavior? And this is really where this real-time personalization comes in. We know that customers tend to kind of browse multiple different hotels, and then they actually come back to the homepage to potentially search for their next holiday. And that's where we can start surfacing them the recommended hotels based on their profile overlaid with other profiles of similar matching style. Maybe they're from the north of England and they like to go to Spain, therefore we'll show them a grouping of hotels in Spain. And that's the kind of the first attempt is going to be to personalize the homepage and that recently viewed view, so that actually we can try and suggest potentially different hotels than the ones that they've been looking at, maybe ones that they've not found yet, and see what the behavior is around that. I find that homepage recommendations are very powerful. I mean, Amazon is the king of that, right? And I think that for holidays, it's an interesting one, because unlike a purchase and a recommendation after a purchase, you don't really buy a holiday after a holiday, a vacation after a vacation, right? So in this situation, we want to find hopefully the intersect of the best vacation for someone, but actually also the best vacation for us, right? Be it from a margin perspective or from a monetary perspective. And I think that's where it gets very interesting. The second part that we're going to do with personalization is that in the recommendation is actually going to be when customers don't find the holiday, the vacation they want. So when you're searching, maybe you've searched for different criteria, and maybe that criteria isn't in our library. Maybe we don't have that hotel available on that day, or maybe we don't have any flights. But what we'll use is the profile that we've built up of you when you've been searching, to then live recommend you some different hotels that potentially other customers have been looking at and have booked, so that you don't get that dead end feel of I can't find my perfect vacation. Actually, here's a bunch of other options that you can take a look at and surface that.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk us through the stack a little bit. So I know that you use Redis, and we know you're using RudderStack for the event stream, but are you going to use Spark in the equation to drive sort of modeling and leverage the data that you have in other data stores? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, so I think much like the attribution model piece that we had a diagram of, I believe that what we're going to be doing is using Spark to model that stuff out and then push that into Redis. I think we have a couple of other things that we're looking at. Google does have its own, but I think we've heavily invested in Spark. I think we really love its flexibility and its versatility. So are going to use that to pull data from different data sets, and then use that with RudderStack and warehouse actions to pull that back into Redis, which I think is going to be super powerful, and build that great profile view of our customers, which actually we've never had before. We tend to just treat customers as unknown anonymous users on the site, and it'll be a big upgrade on that.
Sure, that's really exciting. And one thing I do need to say is, I hope one day I get to a point where I book a holiday and then right after I book another holiday.
We hope people get to that as well. Maybe right after COVID, that's when people will really feel like they'll need a holiday right after the next one.
I yeah, when restrictions lift, I'm sure you're going to see a lot of, well, actually, your anomaly detector is going to be very active, I would guess, for a while.
Yes, it is. It is going on fire right now
Yeah,
with on a daily basis. I think well, we're hoping that people will be booking multiple holidays in the future because of the current situation.
sure. Great. Well, that is really exciting stuff. Let's quickly do a Q&A, so feel free to jump into the live chat. Let's see. Okay, interesting question. So you're the head of engineering, and you interact with data engineering and data science. How do you, just give us, the question is, how do you structure those teams in terms of collaboration, being the head of engineering?
Yeah, so I think what we tend to work on are kind of, so I think like the data science team works on quite a few things that never really have any impact on the front end and all of that. So like data science, for example, will work very closely with PPC on models to figure out how to optimize our bidding. But when it comes to working with the customer, we try and always kind of build our initiatives around solving the problem for the customer and how does data science fit into that. So I think the perfect example is actually what we're working on right now, which is this live sort order. And that is very much a collaborative effort where a couple of the data scientists are working in weekly sprints with the engineers from digital product and the platform team to figure out how we're integrating the sort order, and how also we're thinking about building it for the future. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can enhance the sort order capability by giving it things like geolocation from your CDN, etc. So we generally work in kind of cross-functional teams, and we'll I guess surround ourselves in like we'll create a team to go after a specific project once we need data scientists, etc., and go after it like that. I think generally it's a very collaborative process where each of the teams will get together and have an actual team of teams stand up and figure out what they need to work on next to integrate all of the different moving parts.
Sure. All right, another question here, which I think is a great question. How do you decide when you need to move from a SaaS tool to building something internally?
I think when you've asked the question like 4 times in the short period of time is probably a good indicator. I think it's when you start asking yourself that question, it's time to build out the case for and against it. I'm always I'm usually in the opinion of buy versus build, unless you're in the business of doing that. And I think that when it comes to these sort of things, it's really about when you start seeing the upper limitations of what you have, and
Sure.
you're starting to grow over a certain size, then I think that that's when you start looking into that warehouse first. But really, you can always start with it. I think that nowadays the entry level of it and the ability to just start from doing that is great. Figuring it out, I think, is a balance of cost, resource, and then also thinking kind of 2 steps into the future. Are we going to need this in 6 months' time? Well, if you are, start thinking about doing it now, because
Sure.
it takes time, but it's worth it. And I think the output of it is invaluable.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting, we had a webinar around how, a couple of weeks ago, around how the data stack changes over time throughout the life cycle of a company. And one of the interesting things that came out of it was that the barrier of entry to start building this stuff now has dropped drastically, even in the last couple of years. From a data infrastructure standpoint, and really even from a data warehouse standpoint, the cost of actually sort of building an own infrastructure pipeline warehouse first approaches, both from a tooling standpoint and from a resources standpoint, it's a great time to be doing it, just because it's become so much more accessible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the entry level now to all of these things is just, yeah, it's so easy, and I think it's just going to get easier. So it's if you're starting from scratch, I highly recommend that you consider that warehouse first model, because it will give you the flexibility in the future. And if you don't know anything about analytics and all of that, it's probably a good time to kind of to learn a little bit more about how you can pull data from places like BigQuery and analyze it.
Sure. All right, well, we are at time. We don't have time for any additional questions, unfortunately. But we really appreciate you joining us on the webinar, David. Tons of interesting stuff here, tons of learnings. And let's hop on another webinar once you get some of the personalization stuff built out. And we will we'll walk through that stack once it's up and running.
Yeah, sounds great. Look forward to that. And thank you for having me again.
All right. Talk soon, David.
Bye.